How does a child vanish in the middle of a crowded celebration without a sound, a witness, or a trace? Nathan Foster was 6 when he disappeared on the 4th of July at Riverview Park, a night meant for fireworks and laughter turned into an unspeakable mystery. The clues we found were chilling. The answers? Even worse. Let me tell you the story. But be warned, some questions are never meant to be answered. July 4th, 2002. The air was heavy with the mingling scents of sizzling barbecue, sparklers burning low, and the acrid tang of nearby fireworks. The kind of evening where you could feel the warmth radiating off the pavement long after the sun had set. In the heart of a bustling Midwestern town, every street seemed alive with the chatter of families and the crackle of distant celebrations. People laughed, children darted between legs, and music spilled from open doors. It was a perfect American holiday. Until it wasn't. That year, the town's grand fireworks display was held at Riverview Park, an expansive stretch of green flanked by dense woods on one side and a lazy river on the other. It was the town's pride, a place everyone visited but few truly knew. When the first firework erupted into a bouquet of white, the crowd erupted with cheers. I stood on the outskirts, not as a spectator but as a sentinel. I was Detective Aaron Caldwell, assigned to oversee security that evening, an assignment I had reluctantly accepted. Holidays had a way of exposing human nature at its worst: too much booze, short tempers, or a misplaced sense of invincibility. But the call I received that night wasn't about a fight or a drunken accident. It was the kind of call that makes you question whether you'll ever feel the same again. "Detective," the voice on the radio crackled, tense and clipped. "We've got a report of a missing child. 6 years old, last seen at Riverview Park." The joy and reverie around me seemed to grow louder, almost mocking in its indifference to what I had just heard. A child gone missing, in a crowd this size? It felt like a thread being pulled from the fabric of something much larger, something waiting to unravel. I didn't know yet that this case would consume the next year of my life, or that it would become the one I'd never solve. The initial moments of a missing child report are a blur of action and raw panic. By the time I reached the scene, a patch of grass near a carousel spinning lazily under dim lights, the mother was already screaming her son's name into the night. "Nathan! Nathan!" Her voice cracked, tears streaming down her face as her husband tried to console her, his own panic barely contained beneath the surface. Nathan Foster, 6 years old. Last seen wearing a red t-shirt with a cartoon rocket and denim shorts. He'd been playing near the carousel, his parents said. One second he was there, laughing with the other kids, and the next gone. The father insisted. "He's not the type to wander off. He knows not to go far." I'd heard that before. Every parent believed their child was an exception until they weren't. But something in his voice, something brittle, made me hesitate before dismissing him. The carnival workers shut the rides down immediately, their faces grim. Crowds began to thin as people realized something was wrong, whispers spreading like wildfire. Police officers combed the area in neat rows, flashlights slicing through the darkness. I watched as beams of light bounced off carnival booths and reflected dully off the still water of the river. The woods bordering the park were a different story. Their shadows absorbed the light, swallowing it whole. Thick underbrush and ancient trees created a perfect labyrinth, the kind of place where someone could get lost, or disappear entirely. "Maybe he's hiding," an officer suggested, his voice hesitant. "Kids do that when they're scared." I nodded, though the word hiding felt wrong. The area wasn't so large that a child couldn't hear the calls echoing through the night. And yet, there was no response. No little voice calling out for mom or dad. Just the rhythmic hum of cicadas in the humid air. We found his flip-flops first. They were near the tree line, one angled unnaturally as if it had been yanked off in haste. I crouched, picking one up. It was small, bright blue, with the imprint of a tiny foot on the insole. It looked oddly abandoned, like a discarded breadcrumb in a trail that didn't seem to lead anywhere. For the first time that night, a chill worked its way down my spine. By midnight, the park had transformed from a festive haven to a grim search zone. Officers spread out, scouring every inch of Riverview Park. The glow of flashlights danced like fireflies, and the once carefree crowd had dissolved into a small, uneasy cluster of volunteers. Parents clutched their children tightly, their joy now overshadowed by a creeping paranoia. If Nathan could vanish, so could theirs. I coordinated with the officers, keeping my voice steady despite the knot in my stomach. Focus on the woods, the riverbank, and any nearby structures. He couldn't have gone far. But even as I said it, doubt began to creep in. The woods were dense, yes, but we had enough people to comb through them efficiently. The river was sluggish, unlikely to carry him away unnoticed. And the structures? Most were closed concession stands or storage sheds, all of which had been checked. Except for one. Caldwell, an officer called out, his flashlight pointing to a dilapidated building on the edge of the park, partially hidden by overgrown brush. It was an old maintenance shed, long abandoned. The door hung ajar, its rusted hinges creaking faintly in the breeze. I hesitated. The shed wasn't supposed to be there. It wasn't on any of the park's blueprints, and I'd worked this beat long enough to know its layout well. Check it, I ordered. 2 officers moved in cautiously, their beams cutting through the doorway's darkness. I held my breath, waiting for a cry or a sound, anything. But what came back was worse, silence. They emerged moments later, shaking their heads. Empty. Just some broken equipment and rotting wood. I stepped closer, peering inside. The air was thick, damp, carrying a faint, unpleasant smell, earthy and metallic, like something that had been left to rot in the dark. My eyes scanned the floor, landing on something half buried beneath debris. It was a red thread. I crouched, pulling it free. It was frayed at the edges, but unmistakable, a strand from a t-shirt, the exact color Nathan's parents had described. My chest tightened. We were close. Too close for comfort. I radioed in the Discovery, marking the shed for forensic examination. Still, a nagging thought clawed at my mind as I stared into the shadows. If Nathan had been here, he wasn't now. Something, or someone, had moved him. The shed marked the last tangible trace of Nathan Foster. Beyond its splintered walls lay the woods, an expanse that seemed to stretch endlessly into darkness. My gut told me that if we were going to find anything, or anyone, it would be there. Search teams pushed deeper into the trees, their radios crackling as they coordinated their efforts. The air inside the forest was different, heavier, as though the weight of the humid night couldn't penetrate the thick canopy above. Shadows shifted with every beam of light, creating illusions that tugged at the corners of the mind. The woods weren't just an obstacle, they were a predator in their own right. Thorny brambles clawed at clothing, and uneven ground threatened to twist an ankle with every step. Still, we pressed on. I couldn't shake the thought of those flip-flops and the red thread, each a breadcrumb leading to a place I didn't want to go. Then, just as the team ahead radioed that they'd reached the first clearing, I spotted something. A faint impression in the dirt, partially obscured by fallen leaves. I crouched, brushing them aside with gloved hands. A small footprint, unmistakably a child's, headed toward the woods. Nathan, I whispered under my breath, though the stillness swallowed the name whole. I followed the tracks, their direction meandering yet deliberate, as though someone had been guiding him. My flashlight caught a glint of something snagged in the underbrush ahead, a strip of fabric. Red again. I bagged it and radioed the team leader. I've got more signs. Keep moving forward, toward the clearing. But the clearing brought no comfort. The ground was bare except for an ancient oak tree at its center, its gnarled roots spilling out like twisted veins. The search team stopped, their beams fanning out across the area. What is that? An officer muttered, his light fixed on the base of the tree. I approached and saw what had drawn his attention, a small toy car, its plastic body scuffed and dirt-streaked. I bent down, turning it over in my hand. It was yellow, one of the cheap kind you'd win at a carnival booth, a toy that shouldn't have been here unless Nathan had dropped it. The quiet suddenly felt oppressive. The team had stopped moving, stopped talking, as though everyone had collectively held their breath. A loud crack shattered the silence, a branch snapping somewhere deeper in the woods. Every flashlight whipped in its direction, their beams converging on a patch of thick brush. For a moment, nothing moved. Then came another sound, quieter this time, but unmistakable, a soft, wet rustling, like something heavy dragging through leaves. Someone, or something, was out there. The sound of movement in the brush jolted the team into action. Flashlights swung erratically, their beams flickering across the trees as officers moved cautiously toward the noise. My heart was pounding, but years of training kept my steps measured. Every muscle in my body screamed to move faster, but I knew better. Rushing would only make us careless. "Eyes up," I warned, my voice low but firm over the radio. "Whatever's out there doesn't want to be found." The rustling stopped as suddenly as it had started, leaving us in an oppressive silence. It wasn't just the absence of sound, it was the presence of something else, something unnatural, watching. Waiting. Then the brush exploded with movement. A figure darted through the undergrowth, just outside the reach of our lights. It was too quick, too erratic to make out any details, but one thing was certain, it was human-shaped. "Freeze!" an officer shouted, his flashlight beam chasing the figure as it disappeared deeper into the woods. The team surged forward, myself included. Branches lashed at my face, and roots snagged my boots, but I kept moving, the beam of my flashlight swinging wildly as I tried to catch another glimpse of the figure. My chest heaved as I pushed through a dense thicket, and for a brief moment, I saw it again, a silhouette against the faint glow of moonlight filtering through the trees. It wasn't a child. It was taller, leaner, with a gait that was both frantic and deliberate. Whoever it was, they didn't look back. They just ran, their movements jerky, like a puppet on invisible strings. Then they were gone, swallowed by the forest. I stopped, my breath loud in my ears. The rest of the team caught up moments later, their flashlights cutting through the gloom but finding nothing. "Lost him," one of them muttered, frustrated. "No," I said, my voice colder than I intended. "He let us lose him." The words felt wrong even as I said them. This wasn't just someone fleeing because they were scared. The way the figure had moved, the way they'd led us deeper into the woods, it felt calculated. Deliberate. I turned to the nearest officer. "Mark the spot. We'll comb back through here at first light." The officer nodded, but his expression was grim. He wasn't the only one who felt it, an invisible pressure, as though the woods themselves were closing in on us. Whatever had been here wasn't just leading us, it was toying with us. As we regrouped to head back, my radio crackled to life. "Caldwell, this is base. We've got something on the riverbank." The riverbank was a 15-minute hike from where we'd been, but the journey felt much longer. The woods grew quieter as we moved, the usual nighttime sounds muted, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Even the officers, who had been murmuring among themselves, fell silent. By the time we reached the water's edge, a faint mist had begun to roll in, swirling around our boots as we approached the scene. 2 officers from the earlier team were standing near the bank, their flashlights fixed on something half submerged in the mud. The beam of one light wavered as its holder shifted uneasily. "What have we got?" I asked, stepping closer. One of them pointed, his face pale. "That." At first I didn't see it. The ground near the river was a chaotic mess of reeds, mud, and debris carried in by the current. But then the beam of my flashlight caught a glimmer, a shape nestled among the weeds. It was a backpack. Small, red, with a cartoon rocket stitched on the front. Nathan's. I knelt by the bank, careful not to disturb the area, and leaned in for a closer look. The bag was caked in mud, its zipper partially open, revealing a crumpled drawing inside, a crude crayon sketch of a smiling sun and stick figures. The sight of it hit me harder than I expected, a reminder of the boy we were trying to find. "Anything else?" I asked, my voice tight. "Not here," one officer said. "But there's this." He pointed a little farther down the bank, where the mud seemed disturbed, as though something had been dragged. The marks led toward the water, vanishing at the river's edge. I followed the trail, my flashlight tracing the grooves in the mud. They weren't deep, too shallow to be from a person being pulled. Something smaller, lighter. My mind raced through possibilities, none of them good. Kneeling again, I shined my light into the water. The surface rippled faintly, reflecting the pale glow of the moon, but below it was murky, impenetrable. I couldn't see more than a foot down, but I knew the river's reputation. It wasn't just lazy, it was deceptive. Beneath its calm surface lay unpredictable currents and deep pockets that could swallow anything, or anyone. "We need divers," I said, rising. "Get a team out here ASAP." As the officers relayed my request, I took a moment to scan the opposite bank. The woods there were darker, denser, and completely untouched. A perfect hiding place. My eyes lingered on the tree line, searching for any sign of movement, but there was nothing. Just shadows. And yet I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The divers arrived within the hour, their gear gleaming under the harsh beams of portable floodlights set up along the bank. The once silent river now seemed alive with sound, the churn of engines from a small search boat, the murmur of officers coordinating efforts, and the low hum of generators powering the lights. But beneath it all was a pervasive unease, an unspoken fear that we were about to uncover something no one wanted to see. I stood on the bank as the first diver slipped into the water, the surface rippling outward in lazy circles. The river was deceptive, its sluggish current belying its treacherous depths. I'd seen it claim lives before, swimmers, drunk teenagers, even a seasoned fisherman once, but I'd never seen it take a child. "Visibility's bad," the lead diver called, his voice muffled through the radio. "We'll sweep this area first, then expand the search." I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. My eyes scanned the river, its dark surface impenetrable under the floodlights. Somewhere out there, or beneath, it felt like the answers were waiting. Minutes dragged into an hour. The divers surfaced periodically, their faces grim as they shook their heads and reported no sign of Nathan. I wanted to feel relief, but each passing moment only deepened my dread. If he wasn't here, then where was he? Finally, one of the divers emerged, holding something aloft. A collective hush fell over the search team as he waded toward the bank, water streaming off his wetsuit. In his hand was a shoe, a small, blue flip-flop, the mate to the one we'd found earlier near the woods. I took it from him carefully, the weight of it feeling impossibly light. There was no mud on it, no signs of struggle. It was as if it had simply floated there, carried by the current. Yet something about it felt wrong, like it didn't belong in the river at all. Before I could dwell on it, another call came through the radio. "Caldwell, we've got a civilian on the far bank. Says they saw something?" "On my way," I said, signaling for a small boat to ferry me across. The ride was quick, the engine cutting through the water with an unsettling smoothness. The far bank was as I'd suspected, darker, untouched, with dense underbrush and towering trees. The civilian, a local man in his 50s, was waiting near the edge, his face pale in the moonlight. "I didn't know if I should say anything," he began, his voice shaky. "But I swear I saw someone over here earlier tonight. Right before the fireworks." My heart sank. "What did they look like?" He hesitated, wringing his hands. "Tall. Thin. Couldn't see their face. They were just standing there, right at the tree line, like they were watching the park. And then?" He looked away, his eyes distant. "Then they disappeared. Into the woods." I glanced toward the trees, their shadows dense and forbidding. It felt like the river and the woods were conspiring to keep their secrets. And whatever, or whoever, had been here was now long gone. The civilian's account added weight to a theory I hadn't wanted to entertain. Nathan's disappearance wasn't an accident. Someone had been watching. Someone had been waiting. But the question remained, why? As the night wore on, exhaustion began to gnaw at the edges of my focus. The search pressed on with a renewed urgency, the river and woods combed methodically. But as dawn threatened to break, something shifted. "Caldwell," an officer's voice crackled over the radio. "You're going to want to see this." The coordinates he gave weren't far from the riverbank. I arrived to find a small team clustered around a clearing, their flashlights trained on something half buried in the dirt. My stomach churned before I even saw what it was. It was a doll. The thing was old, its features worn smooth by time and the elements. A porcelain face with faint cracks, empty black eyes, and a sewn smile that felt grotesque in the pale light. Its dress was faded, its limbs stiff. But what struck me most was its position, seated upright, facing the woods, its tiny hands clasped in its lap as though it had been carefully placed there. "Found it like this," an officer said. "No footprints. Nothing disturbed." The doll's presence was eerie enough, but there was something else. Around its neck hung a piece of red string, tied in a crude bow. The frayed ends matched the threads we'd found earlier near the shed. I stared at the doll, my mind racing. It wasn't just a toy, it was a message. Someone had left it here deliberately, mocking us, taunting us. But why? And what did it mean for Nathan? The oppressive silence of the woods returned, thick and smothering. I could feel eyes on me again, an unshakable sense of being watched. Whoever had placed the doll was still out there, lurking just beyond the reach of our lights. "Mark the area," I said, my voice tight. "We'll have forensics process it." But even as I walked away, I knew we wouldn't find anything useful. This was the work of someone meticulous, someone who knew exactly how to cover their tracks. And they'd done this before. The search officially ended 2 weeks later. Despite our efforts, the divers, the cadaver dogs, the endless shifts combing the woods and the riverbank, Nathan Foster was never found. The doll, the flip-flops, and the scraps of red thread became haunting fragments of a story we couldn't piece together. The town mourned, as towns do. There were candlelight vigils and flyers stapled to every telephone pole. His parents, hollow-eyed and grief-stricken, made tearful pleas on local news stations. But as the summer wore on and no new leads surfaced, the case faded from headlines, replaced by fresher tragedies. For me, it never faded. I pored over every report, every photograph, every note in the case file until the details were etched into my memory: the blue flip-flops, the red t-shirt, the eerie placement of the doll. I tried to construct a narrative, a logical progression of events, but no matter how many scenarios I entertained, they all ended in the same place: nowhere. The civilian's account of the shadowy figure at the tree line stuck with me. Who were they? A stranger passing through? Someone familiar with the park? I requested background checks on anyone who'd ever worked at Riverview Park, but none raised red flags. The more I investigated, the more it felt like chasing smoke. By the time a year had passed, the town had moved on. The park hosted another 4th of July celebration, this one quieter, more subdued. I didn't attend. I couldn't. Riverview Park had become a scar, a place where the echoes of Nathan's laughter still haunted the trees and the carousel stood as a silent monument to his disappearance. One night, months after the case went cold, I found myself back at the park. I don't know what drew me there. Maybe guilt, maybe hope, maybe the faintest sliver of belief that I'd missed something. The park was deserted, its rides silent, its paths lit only by the flicker of a dying street lamp. I wandered to the tree line where we'd found his flip-flops. The air was still, the woods eerily quiet. And then I heard it, faint, almost imperceptible, but there. A sound that froze me where I stood. Laughter. High, childish, and unmistakably distant, it floated through the trees before fading into silence. My flashlight darted into the darkness, but there was nothing. Just shadows, stretching long and thin beneath the skeletal branches. I never told anyone about that moment. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was my own guilt manifesting in the worst way. Or maybe it was something else entirely, something I didn't want to believe. Nathan Foster's file still sits on my desk, its contents worn from constant handling. His picture stares back at me, a bright-eyed boy with a mischievous grin, frozen in time. Every now and then, I get a call about a new lead, a reported sighting, a vague tip, but none of them ever go anywhere. They say there's nothing worse than not knowing. They're right. Epilogue. To this day, Riverview Park carries the stain of that night. Nathan Foster's case remains unsolved, A chilling reminder of how quickly joy can turn to terror, and how sometimes the darkest mysteries are never meant to be unraveled.